A forgotten widow helped a wounded rancher along the road, not knowing who he really was. No one stopped when they saw him lying near the edge of the old road, and Eliza Hart understood immediately why, because in this town, strangers were not helped. They were evaluated, and anyone who looked like trouble was quietly left to the dust. By the time she reached him, most people had already passed, their footsteps curving away from his body as if kindness were something that required permission. And she realized that whatever had happened to him was not important enough to outweigh the fear of getting involved. As she knelt beside him, she noticed the blood darkening his sleeve and the way his breathing faltered, uneven and restrained. And in that moment, she understood something more unsettling than injury, that if she walked away now, no one would question her choice. Everyone believed the story was already finished, except a widow who had nothing left to lose by caring. Eliza hesitated only once, because helping him meant stepping into a situation she did not understand. And in this town, women like her were expected to remain invisible, not intervene in matters that might attract attention. Yet as she touched his shoulder and felt the faint tremor beneath his coat, she made a decision that would quietly pull her into a life she had never imagined. As she struggled to drag him toward the shade of the abandoned shed, she noticed something strange about his hands, the calluses too deliberate, the posture too controlled for a simple traveler, and a thought flickered through her mind that she quickly dismissed. That this man did not look like someone who had been defeated by chance. And as she worked to keep him conscious, unaware of the eyes beginning to gather at a distance, she did not realize that if this stranger survived, the town would not only question why she had helped him, but who he really was. Because sometimes the most dangerous act in a quiet town is not violence, but mercy offered to the wrong man. Eliza did not tell anyone what she was doing, not because she thought it wrong, but because she had learned that explanations invited opinions, and opinions in this town often arrived before facts had a chance to breathe. So she worked quietly, pulling the wounded man deeper into the shade of the shed, where broken tools and forgotten crates had long stopped attracting attention, her hands moving with careful urgency as she cleaned the blood from his arm, with water drawn from the nearby well, aware that every passing moment was a choice she could still undo if she wanted to. The man stirred once, his fingers tightening briefly against the rough fabric of her sleeve, and the strength of that grip startled her, because it did not belong to someone on the edge of collapse. And for a moment she wondered whether she had misread the situation entirely. Yet when his eyes opened, they held no confusion, only awareness sharpened by pain, as if he were measuring the world even while lying broken within it. He tried to speak, but the effort turned into a quiet cough, and Eliza told him to save his breath, her voice low enough to avoid carrying beyond the shed, because she felt instinctively that whatever he was not someone who should be discovered too quickly. Outside, footsteps slowed, then passed, then slowed again, and Eliza felt the invisible pressure of the town tightening around her actions, because people noticed when the forgotten widow stopped being forgettable, and she realized that helping him was no longer just an act of mercy. It was becoming a visible deviation from the role she had been assigned. When she finished binding his wound, she saw something else that unsettled her more than blood. The quality of his clothing beneath the dust, the stitching too precise, the leather too well cared for. And she wondered how a man who carried such signs of order had ended up abandoned on a road where chaos usually traveled alone. He looked at her again, longer this time, and asked quietly why she had not walked away like the others. And the question struck deeper than accusation, because it suggested that he already understood the rules of this town better than she wanted him to. Eliza answered that some people were only ignored because no one expected them to matter, and that being ignored sometimes made it easier to do what others were afraid to do. But as she spoke, she sensed movement beyond the shed, shadows pausing where they should have passed, and she realized with a tightening in her chest that the town was beginning to notice not the injured man, but her presence beside him. And in that moment she understood that if anyone discovered who he truly was, the quiet mercy she had offered might be recast as something far more dangerous than kindness. Eliza did not leave the shed when the shadows outside shifted, because leaving would have meant admitting fear, and fear had never protected anyone in this town. It had only taught people how to disappear quietly. So she remained beside the wounded man, her movement slower now, deliberate, as though calm itself could keep danger from forming. The stranger watched her in silence, his gaze steady despite the pain etched across his face, and the absence of panic in his eyes unsettled her more than anger would have, because men who had nothing to lose usually did not look like this, measuring the world with quiet precision even while bleeding. When he finally spoke again, his voice was low and controlled. He asked how long he had been lying on the road before she found him, and Eliza hesitated before answering, because she understood that the question was not about time, but about people, about how many had seen him and chosen not to stop. And she told him the truth, that enough had passed to make his survival unlikely if she had arrived any later. The man closed his eyes briefly, not in relief but in calculation, and when he opened them again, he asked another question that made her heart tighten. Did anyone else help? Eliza shook her head, and something like satisfaction flickered across his expression before it disappeared, replaced by the same quiet restraint. And she wondered what kind of man felt safer knowing he had been ignored by everyone except a widow with nothing to offer him. Outside, the footsteps finally faded, but the air did not feel lighter, because Eliza sensed that the town's attention had not vanished. It had merely withdrawn to observe from a distance, and she realized that her act of kindness had already begun to shift how people looked at her. Because in a place where survival depended on conformity, deviation was remembered longer than virtue. As she helped the stranger sit up against a wooden crate, she noticed again the details that did not fit. The disciplined way he held his shoulders, the absence of desperation in his voice, the careful economy of his movements. And a question formed in her mind that she did not dare to ask, because asking it would mean admitting that she might have pulled more than a wounded traveler into her quiet life. The man studied her for a long moment and said that people rarely help without expecting something in return, and when Eliza replied that expectation was a luxury she could not afford, he looked at her differently, as if she had confirmed something he had been searching for. And in that moment she felt a strange awareness settle over her, because she understood that if he recovered, he would not simply walk away as other travelers did, and that whatever truth he carried would eventually surface. And when it did, the town would not remember her as the widow who had been forgotten, but as the woman who had chosen the wrong man to save. By the time the sun began to sink behind the low hills, Eliza understood that saving the stranger had already changed the shape of her life, because danger did not always arrive with noise. Sometimes it arrived with the quiet certainty that something could no longer be undone. And as she watched the wounded man breathe more steadily beside the stacked crates, she felt the strange mixture of relief and dread that came from realizing she had crossed a line the town would never forget. He asked her for water again, not weakly but with measured control, and when she handed him the cup, their fingers brushed briefly, and the steadiness of his grip startled her, because it carried neither desperation nor gratitude, only awareness, as if he were memorizing the world rather than clinging to it. He told her his name was Caleb, in a voice that revealed nothing else, and though the name sounded ordinary, something about the way he said it made her doubt its simplicity, because men who had lived ordinary lives rarely carried silence the way he did. Outside the shed, a horse whinnied where no horse should have been, and Eliza felt her pulse tighten, because she had not heard anyone approach. Yet footsteps followed, slow and deliberate, stopping just beyond the warped wooden wall, as if whoever stood there did not wish to be seen, but wanted their presence to be felt. Caleb's eyes sharpened instantly, the pain in his expression replaced by something colder, and without speaking he shifted slightly, placing himself at an angle that allowed him to see the door while keeping Eliza behind him, and the instinctive precision of the movement unsettled her more than the footsteps outside, because it revealed that he was not simply a wounded man reacting to danger. He was someone who had learned long ago how to anticipate it. The shadow lingered for several seconds, long enough for Eliza to feel the weight of being watched, then slowly retreated, leaving the air heavier rather than lighter. And when silence returned, Caleb looked at her and asked quietly whether anyone in this town knew her well enough to defend her if questions were asked. The question struck like a sudden chill, because it suggested that he already understood something she had not fully admitted to herself, that helping him had not only made her visible, it had made her vulnerable. And when she hesitated before answering, Caleb's gaze hardened not with fear, but with recognition, as if he had just confirmed a truth he had suspected from the beginning. Eliza tried to tell herself that the shadow outside meant nothing, that curiosity was common in a place where boredom often disguised itself as concern. Yet as she looked at Caleb's face in the dimming light, she realized that whatever had found him on the road had not disappeared. It had merely begun to search more carefully, and in that moment she understood, with a tightening in her chest, that saving him had not only pulled him into her life, it had quietly invited something else into it as well, something that would not be satisfied with silence or distance. And as Caleb slowly rose to his feet for the first time since she had found him, standing with far more strength than his wounds should have allowed, Eliza felt a realization settle over her with terrifying clarity. That the man she had saved wasn't running from danger, he was waiting for it. Eliza did not ask Caleb how he could stand so firmly when his wounds should have kept him weak, because asking would have forced him to answer. And answers, she sensed, were the one thing he had no intention of giving. So she watched him in silence as he steadied himself against the wooden beam, his breathing controlled, his eyes scanning the shed as if he were not hiding inside it, but preparing to leave it on his own terms. He told her quietly that he would not stay long, that men who were meant to be found rarely survived by remaining visible. And the way he spoke unsettled her, because it suggested that his injury had never been the greatest danger he faced. Outside, the town settled into evening with its familiar sounds, doors closing, voices lowering, footsteps fading. But Eliza felt no comfort in the routine, because she understood that familiarity often masked attention rather than absence, and that people who had noticed her once would not easily forget what they had seen. Caleb asked her what kind of woman she had been before she became invisible, and the question struck deeper than any accusation, because it forced her to confront a version of herself the town had slowly erased. And when she told him that invisibility was not something chosen but learned, he looked at her with an expression that carried neither pity nor surprise, only recognition, as though he had lived among people who learned the same skill. As the light dimmed further, Eliza noticed movement again beyond the shed. Not one shadow, but several, their shapes barely visible through the warped boards. And this time, Caleb did not wait to confirm what she sensed. He stepped forward with quiet decisiveness, his hand brushing her arm not in fear but in warning, and told her that whoever had come earlier was not alone. Eliza felt the weight of his words settle over her, because she understood that if people were watching, they were not watching him. They were watching her, the widow who had dared to intervene where others had chosen indifference. And in that realization she felt the first true fear since she had found him on the road. Not fear of violence, but fear of becoming a story the town would not tell kindly. Caleb looked toward the door again, his posture shifting from wounded traveler to something far more controlled. And he said quietly that if anyone asked about him, she should deny everything. because truth in the wrong hands was more dangerous than lies. And before she could ask what he meant, footsteps began to move closer to the shed. Slower now, deliberate, no longer pretending to pass by, and as the handle on the warped wooden door trembled under an unseen hand, Eliza understood with sudden clarity that whatever Caleb was hiding from had finally decided to stop searching from a distance, and that the kindness she had offered in silence was about to be tested in the open. The door did not open immediately, and that delay was what frightened Eliza most, because hesitation often meant calculation rather than curiosity, and as the handle trembled once more before falling still, she felt the air inside the shed tighten, as though the space itself were holding its breath. Caleb did not move toward the door or away from it. Instead, he shifted slightly to her side, positioning himself not as someone seeking cover, but as someone preparing to confront whatever waited outside. And the quiet certainty of his movement unsettled her more deeply than the footsteps had, because it revealed that he was not reacting instinctively. He was following a pattern he had learned long ago. When the door finally creaked open, a man stepped inside whose clothes were too clean for travel and whose eyes were too sharp for idle curiosity, and the way he looked past Eliza directly at Caleb told her that this was not a chance encounter, but the end of a search. The stranger spoke Caleb's name softly, not as a greeting but as confirmation, and in that single word, the fragile illusion of anonymity collapsed, because names carried weight in a town where reputation traveled faster than truth. Eliza felt her pulse quicken, because she realized that the wounded man she had saved was not simply known, he was sought, and the man at the door addressed him with a tone that balanced respect and warning, telling him that people had been looking for him since morning, and that disappearing from the road was not something a man of his standing could afford. Caleb did not deny the implication, and when he stepped forward, his posture straight and his voice calm. He asked quietly how far the news had traveled, and the visitor answered that it had traveled far enough for questions to begin forming where answers were not yet welcome. Eliza listened in silence, piecing together fragments that made her chest tighten, because she understood that whatever Caleb's true identity was, it carried consequences that reached far beyond this shed, and that by choosing to save him, she had unknowingly stepped into a world whose rules she did not know how to navigate. When the visitor finally turned his attention toward her, his gaze measured and cautious, he asked whether she knew who she had brought into her home. And Eliza hesitated, not because she lacked words, but because she sensed that any answer she gave would change how she was seen forever. And before she could speak, Caleb interrupted quietly, telling the man that she owed him nothing and that he would handle whatever followed. The words spoken not with gratitude, but with authority. And in that moment, Eliza understood, with startling clarity, that the wounded stranger she had rescued was not simply a traveler with secrets. He was a man whose name carried power, and that power, once revealed, would not only transform his fate, but hers as well, because as the visitor stepped back into the fading light and promised that the town would soon know the truth, Eliza felt the final piece of the story settle into place. That the man she had chosen to save was someone the town would never have allowed her to touch if they had known who he really was. The town learned the truth faster than Eliza had imagined, because names like Caleb Rowan did not travel quietly, and by the time the morning sun lifted above the rooftops, whispers had already turned into certainty, certainty into judgment, and judgment into a new kind of curiosity that felt more dangerous than indifference ever had. Yet, as Eliza stood beside Caleb at the edge of the old road where she had first found him, she realized that fear no longer owned her the way it once had, because knowing who he was had not erased the man she had seen bleeding in the dust. It had only revealed how much the town had never understood about either of them. People gathered at a distance, careful not to come too close, their eyes moving between the widow they had forgotten and the rancher they had always feared to approach without permission. And Eliza felt the weight of their attention not as humiliation, but as transformation, because she understood that the town was not shocked by Caleb's identity. It was shocked by her proximity to it, by the fact that she had crossed a boundary no one had expected her to see. Caleb did not explain himself or justify his silence. He simply stood beside her with the same quiet steadiness she had witnessed in the shed. And when someone finally asked why he had allowed a forgotten widow to help him instead of revealing himself sooner, he answered without hesitation that he had wanted to know who would act without knowing his name, and the simplicity of the statement unsettled the crowd more than any confession could have. Eliza felt his words settle inside her slowly, because she realized that what had begun as mercy had become something deeper, a recognition between two people who had learned to survive without applause. When the crowd began to disperse, uncertain how to respond to a story that did not fit their expectations, Caleb turned to her and said quietly that he could not promise her safety from gossip or distance from scrutiny, but he could promise that he would never allow her kindness to be used against her. And Eliza understood that this was not a rescue being offered, but a partnership being proposed. She thought of the years she had spent invisible, of the day she had knelt beside a stranger when no one else would, and of the moment she had realized that the most dangerous act in a quiet town was not defiance, but compassion. And as she looked at Caleb, not as a powerful rancher, not as a wounded man, but as someone who had chosen to see her when the world had not, she felt her answer form without fear. She told him that she had not helped him because of who he was, and she would not stand beside him because of it either, but because in the moment that mattered, he had allowed her kindness to remain pure, unclaimed by reputation or reward. And Caleb's expression shifted in a way she had not seen before, not with pride or authority, but with something closer to relief. As they walked away from the road together, leaving behind a town that no longer knew how to define them, Eliza understood that her life had not changed because she had saved a powerful man, but because she had finally chosen not to remain forgotten. And in the quiet space between their footsteps, she felt the beginning of a future that was not built on names or fear, but on a shared decision that neither of them would ever regret. Because sometimes the deepest kind of love is born not from knowing who someone is, but from choosing them before the world tells you why you shouldn't. She helped him when everyone else walked away. But what if she had known who he really was? Would you have done the same? If this story stayed with you, like the video, share it with someone who loves meaningful stories of love, redemption, and survival. And don't forget to subscribe to The Echoes of a Rancher.